All right, so today's video is going to be on the drawbacks of quitting the big three lifts cold turkey for multiple years on end. This is something that I have a lot of experience in, and this is something that I've been planning to make a video on for quite a while, but I wanted to wait just a little bit longer than I think people wanted me to actually make this video. And the reason for that is because I wanted to gather more evidence in my own training, and more importantly, in my own physique. There were a handful of fears that I had when I stopped doing these big three lifts. There were a handful of theories that I had of the perceived benefits of quitting these big three lifts that I had in my mind kind of at all times when I was training these lifts very hard back in the day. Now that I have years of experience stepping away and going cold turkey on these lifts, I have a pretty accurate assessment in my own personal experience with dropping these lifts entirely. Keep in mind, this is going to be an unbiased video. I'm somebody that has been on both sides of the coin. I've been the person that is dogmatically obsessed with the big three lifts to the point where I would laugh at my friends that didn't do them and call them weak and soft and quite literally think that they were wasting their time in the gym if they didn't squat, bench, and deadlift. And I've also been, obviously to a much lesser extreme, somebody that advocates you at least steer away from these lifts or proceed with caution and know what you're getting into. Be aware of the psychological downsides that these lifts come with, because they do come with baggage, which I've talked about for a year and a half on the channel already, so no need to dive too deep into that. But there's a handful of things that I do see as drawbacks of stopping these lifts, which I'll touch on throughout this video. But first, I want to go over how I see this entire situation. And the best way I can describe it, the best analogy I can use is it's almost like the expectations versus reality meme. When I was doing these big three lifts and taking my training and my progress on those three so incredibly seriously to the point where I would get ridiculous anxiety about hitting PRs every week, I was fearful to drop those lifts because I thought I would shrink. And it wasn't a logical reason that I had in my head. That was emotion speaking. I was worried that if I dropped the lifts that everybody swore by, I would start to lose my size and I would start to shrink. I thought I wouldn't be able to train anything else hard, and these are the lifts that I can go hard on and get good growth from. That turned out to not really be true. There's also some more logical arguments that I had in my head at the time that did prove to be true, and I'll touch on those in a second. But first, I do want to touch on some of my expectations that I had going into dropping these three lifts that turned out to just be false. And looking back, these are emotional, fearful feelings that I was having at the time, and these are exactly that, feelings. The first one that I would tell myself is that I needed squat, bench, and deadlift to drive progress on accessory lifts. So of course, I don't use the term accessory lifts anymore, but I'm trying to tap into my mindset from this era. When I was somebody that was heavily doing these lifts, I thought I would need these lifts to drive progress elsewhere in the gym. So these are the lifts that drive my growth, they drive my size, because progressive overload causes hypertrophy. At least I used to think that. Obviously, I've changed my mind based on more logical reasoning at this point, where I didn't think about that too much before. I was just kind of taking what I was spoon-fed by the industry. Now, the way I see these lifts is they're no different than anything else. A lift is a lift, and that's why I do believe that some of these lifts do become overrated, because there's no extra special benefit. A lift is just a lift, and that's exactly what it is. There's nothing inherently better about them. Of course, there's some lifts that do have certain drawbacks or certain upsides, but there's nothing magical about them, and people swear by them for years, but they can't point out an actual logical reason to why these are better lifts than anything else, really. And I'm not trying to say every lift is created equal, because I think that's equally untruthful, but there's nothing special and magical about these lifts is basically what I'm trying to say. The next fallacy that I fell for to myself was that progressive overload drives hypertrophy, and to build off this, heavy weights build more muscle. So I thought you had to have extremely heavy lifts in your program to drive growth. This isn't necessarily true. I was thinking that I just had to go super heavy and I needed to optimize my technique to lift the heaviest weight to drive the most growth possible. So to quickly summarize this, because I've touched on it way too many times on the channel before, I'm sure some people are annoyed about it by now, but I used to think that it wasn't the stimulus I was getting from the lift that would give me growth, it was the ability to add weight that would get me growth. So switching from a conventional to a sumo deadlift got me bigger. Switching from a straight bar, like a stiff barbell, to a deadlift bar would get me bigger because I could lift more weight with it. And you can see how that's not really a logical argument. That was just an emotional reasoning because I was a little bit fear-mongered into thinking that I had to constantly lift heavier, and not only just lift heavier over time, which does have a valid reasoning behind it in its own, that like heavier weight was quite literally more stimulative than lighter weight. That was a fallacy in itself, and that obviously, as we know, isn't true because of course your technique is what is going to drive your ability to reach your desired proximity to failure, which then drives your growth, and the weight you need is just the most challenging weight you can use to maximize that technique to hit your proximity to failure that you desire in your desired rep range. So to summarize things a little bit quickly, that's the way I see it now, which I do believe to be correct. The last one, and this is probably the biggest mindset mistake that I made back in the day that kept me small, and that's that you need hard lifts in order to grow. And I have a hard time saying that without a smirk because that is the exact mindset that kept me so much smaller than I should have been for such a long time. The reality here is that the lift isn't what's determining how challenging the lift is in most cases. What determines how challenging a lift is the lifter. So I was blaming these lifts for not being hard enough. In reality, I should have pointed the finger inwards and looked at myself and said, I don't try on my lifts that aren't squat, bench, deadlift. Are the squat, bench, deadlift at RPE 10 harder than other lifts in like a systemic sense? Yeah, they're definitely pretty hard lifts. Like definitely. If you've trained a deadlift or a squat as hard as I have, I know a lot of you guys have done that too before, it's pretty obvious those are very difficult lifts. However, just because they feel a little bit more difficult than other lifts doesn't necessarily mean it's more productive. Generally speaking, harder lifts will drive more growth. There is going to be a correlation with that. But there's a difference between a lift being systemically challenging and making you out of breath and making you have a hard time maintaining technique versus getting actual muscular stimulation for growth from that lift. So when you look at how difficult a lift is, effort being equal, those lifts are pretty difficult, but they're not necessarily better. Another issue with this is I wasn't putting them in an even playing field. I was training these lifts always first in the session, always mentally focused and physically ready the most, and every single time, every other lift would be after that, when I drained all my energy already, and I already thought that I did what I needed to grow in the session, which were those lifts. So from my own sabotaging of myself, I failed to get the benefit, and I failed to be able to train hard physically and mentally those other lifts. This is the biggest thing that I've learned from switching away from this style training, is a lift is how hard you make it. I can make a cable hammer curl extremely difficult where I didn't even think to do that before, and no wonder why my arms are above 17 inches now, and they were not even at 16 inches when I was benching 330 plus pounds. So that is one thing that I've learned that I do believe to be the most important lesson of this entire thing. A lift is how hard you make it, and it's up to you to make a lift challenging. If you're taking your lateral raises to 2 reps in reserve, that's exactly why they might not be working. And I'm not going to talk about intensity techniques and proximity to failure because that's a different topic for a different day, but I think you get what I'm saying here. Let's move into the actual downsides at this point of leaving these lifts out. So I went through my perceived downsides and did a little bit of myth busting on my own fear mongering back in the day. Now that I have a very significant amount of time away from these lifts entirely, there are a few downsides I've noticed of not having these lifts in my program. There's a lot of upsides too, which I've already talked about, so this video is going to be reserved to the true downsides from here on out. So let's start with the barbell squat. The biggest downside I've noticed from not including barbell squats in my program is a lack of glute growth. My glutes are definitely not bigger than they were when I was in my power building phase. That's a fact. I haven't measured them, but I can tell. Like I would know if they were bigger. I would know if they were a lot smaller. I don't think they're much smaller. They could be a little smaller. They're probably about the same size, but glutes are definitely not being targeted nearly as effectively with less deadlift and barbell squat volume, that's for sure. A hack squat, which has been my primary quad builder, is less effective for the glutes than something like a low bar squat or even a deadlift for that matter, in my opinion. So willingly choosing to avoid barbell squats, especially in a low bar position, has limited my glute growth significantly. And that's okay because I chose to do that because glutes aren't a very high priority for me at all. So it was well worth the trade. I got a much better stimulus to fatigue in most of my sessions. I'm somebody that trains very hard and I'm relatively strong anyways. So that is for myself a pretty important factor so I can get enough work in for the muscles that I do prioritize. So that is definitely a downside. The glutes are not trained nearly as effectively when you're prioritizing hack squats and not doing barbell squats. Of course, there are ways around this. Of course, I could do a leg press, I could do a squat press, but at the end of the day, if I'm biasing my quads as much as I am and as much as I have been, the glutes are going to be at expense of that. So that is just one factual downside. Like I said, there are ways to work around that, obviously, but when I was doing a squat, bench, deadlift, that wasn't something I really had to think about at all. The next one that I've got is less spinal erector growth from not doing low bar squats. I can say for a fact that if I do have one muscle group that is lagging behind when I used to do these big three lifts, it's the spinal erectors. My glutes definitely aren't any bigger from back then. They're arguably the same size, like I said, maybe a tiny bit smaller with much less emphasis, of course. But the spinal erectors have not nearly been as big as they used to be. That used to be arguably my best muscle group back in those power building days, along with my lats and my delts, because obviously if you guys have been following the channel for a while, those are the two muscle groups I really did train properly. And of course with deadlifts and low bar squats, it's kind of hard not to have jacked spinal erectors too. So when I look back at those old pictures and I look back at my old videos, my spinal erectors were definitely more impressive back then. That muscle group wasn't a priority or something I was really focusing on, but that's just a side effect of training a lot of deadlifts and squats, having big jacked spinal erectors. That's not necessarily a look I'm going for at the moment. I do envision that being a goal that I have down the road because I think as my lats and my traps continue to grow, I do want to keep those up with it. So I probably will have to rotate some deadlifts back into my program or at least increase the volume and or frequency of the RDLs that I'm currently doing right now, which are on a very, very low, if not maintenance volume currently in the program. So moving on to the deadlift. So with the deadlift, the biggest downside of not doing a deadlift off the floor is that you are now forced to do direct trap work if traps are a muscle that you do care to grow. Of course, this is not the most logical argument because if traps are a muscle you care to grow, obviously you should be doing some direct trap work. That's very straightforward. I'd argue some type of power shrug is probably the best way to do that. But when you're not doing deadlifts, if traps are one of those muscles that you want to grow but isn't quite in that top tier list of muscle groups that you care the most about, that's where you get into the gray area of it is a benefit of doing deadlifts. RDLs can maybe maintain your traps. You might be able to grow them a little bit from RDLs. In my experience, I really haven't seen much from them. My traps definitely did grow a bit from doing deadlifts off the floor. I think specifically because I'm weak off the floor, so I get a good yank and a good stretch right from there, and that's obviously stretching of my traps really well, so maybe I saw a little bit more growth than most people would from deadlifts. But at the same time, if I'm not doing deadlifts from the floor, I'm only doing RDLs in my program, the traps will probably lose size. So you'll have to include some type of direct trap work, which is a whole other lift in its own. Now, for some people, that's certainly a drawback, and that's a reason for you to include deadlifts in your program. For myself, I'd rather do a little bit more work and target every muscle a little bit more optimally. I'm not a minimalist, as you guys know. I'd rather just do an extra 2 sets of power shrugs on my day. If it takes an extra 15 minutes, so what? I love lifting. I prioritize lifting. I'm okay with doing that, even if it means just 20% better results. I'm totally cool with that, and I will always take that 100%. So that's definitely the biggest downside about not including barbell deadlifts off the floor. I would say spinal erector growth, kind of the same concept from squat, so I don't want to waste more time and expand on that. That's very straightforward. And then finally, when it comes to not bench pressing, there's no downsides I can think of. I sat on my bed with no distractions, no phone or anything, just sat there and just tried to think about downsides. I can't think of a single downside of not benching. Benching's a little bit different because there's no like specific benefit to benching that other variations can't get you. Obviously, with something like going from a barbell squat to a hack squat, you minimize basically half of your entire body's work. So you obviously your spinal erectors and your upper body don't really have to do much on a hack squat because you have back support versus barbell being on your upper back and your spine tilting forwards. That's very straightforward. Similar-ish concept with deadlifts, but with bench, there's really no drawback to not benching in terms of hypertrophy. It is one of the most overrated lifts, not because it's a bad lift, but I'd say it's overrated because people treat it like it's the best, and it doesn't do anything extra, in my opinion. Another downside to bench, and I just love talking about this stuff because that's what I nerd out about, but obviously people get attached to their numbers. They get attached to the ego hit that they get. Well, maybe ego hit's not the right term. That's usually a drawback on your ego. I'd say the ego boost, the hit of an ego boost, that is a downside with bench because you get too wrapped up in your numbers, you sacrifice your technique. It's so easy just to cheat your form there. So I'd argue that bench is almost a little bit worse from like a psychological perspective if you're just looking for growth. But other than that, like bench is bench. There's nothing special about it, and there's nothing negative if you don't include bench and you just pick other variations. So that's all I've got for downsides about the squat, bench, deadlift. I really haven't noticed much. The pros and the benefits of not doing these three lifts have significantly outweighed the cons. If you guys are interested in the pros video, I would be interested in hearing if you're interested in that. Because I do have quite a few pros of not including these lifts. Of course, I've basically built my entire channel off of this, especially at the beginning. But now that I've been doing this channel for a year and a half, 2 years at this point, of course, I've learned more in that experience too. So if you're curious about that, let me know. I might make a video on it. And with that being said, that's all I got for today. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'll see you guys in the next one.